I want to start by describing 3 freeze-frame moments in my own life. On February the 10th of 1996, I drove from Palo Alto down to San Jose State University with my gymnastics team. I had won several national titles in the junior ranks, had competed for the national team overseas, and I was ranked first in the NCAA. I jumped on the high bar during warm-ups, swung around the bar very quickly a couple times, and let go to do a triple backflip dismount. This was a new dismount for me, but something felt wrong in the process. The bar felt loose. So I opened up out of my tuck and found myself about 18 feet in the air above the high bar, desperately trying to avoid hitting the bar on the way down and rotating backwards as I fell. I didn't land exactly on my head, and I didn't land exactly on my back. It was somewhere in between, awkwardly, partway off the mat, and it felt as though a hot water balloon had burst inside my neck. My neck was broken badly as it happens, with vertebrae and discs in pieces. But I didn't know it at the time. I was, back then, more muscular. I made sure I could still move my arms and my legs. I jumped back up on the bar and took another turn. I went and tumbled on the floor exercise. The competition started, and I competed on the pommel horse. And it would actually be 2 days before I went to a hospital in excruciating pain and asked for an X-ray. The doctors panicked when they saw the images. They wheeled me up to a room, and they began screwing a halo into my head. This is a metallic band, and they put it in your head. They attach it to a cable, run the cable over the bed, and add weights until it pulls you out straight, and you're no longer in danger, because the slightest wrong turn could have damaged my spine irrevocably, making me a quadriplegic. But the odd thing was, I felt a strange kind of elation. I was laughing, and I was smiling and joking with the doctors. They asked me, "You do understand what we're telling you?" But in that moment, to be honest, I felt such a profound and powerful sense of God's presence and love that I just felt like singing. It was liberating. If I could have the peace and the joy of God, even when my health and my dreams were being stripped away from me, then what did I have to fear? What a liberating truth it is that no matter what the world may take, it cannot take your fellowship with God. It cannot take the one thing needful. Shortly after a spinal fusion surgery, I left the hospital and watched a movie called Restoration, in which the protagonist, Robert Downey Jr., approaches a monastery, and there on the door to the monastery are the words, "Behold, I have refined you in the furnace of affliction." Second freeze frame. A few years later, it became necessary to have a second fusion surgery to my neck. The surgery itself went fine, but the recovery was botched. The nurses failed to notice for over 24 hours that the morphine drip was not actually dripping. I was receiving no pain relief, was actually in withdrawal from the pain medication that I had been taking prior to the surgery. Then I was prescribed the wrong medicine, and while the medicine can sometimes produce euphoria, it can also produce something called dysphoria, which is what it sounds like, the opposite. Now, I had gone into the surgery expecting another mountaintop experience of God's presence and goodness, and instead it felt more powerfully than it had ever felt in my life, as though the world were empty and meaningless and godless. Through a series of panic attacks, it felt as though I was struggling to hold on to the pieces of a rapidly disintegrating sanity. I didn't know this at the time, but my idol of who God was in the process of being dismantled. I had to die to one way, a false way of thinking about God, in order to encounter the God of Jesus Christ anew. I realized that I had to learn to trust and love God, even when it seems for all the world as though there is no such thing. Last snapshot, in the autumn of 2009, I sat my one-year-old daughter, a daddy's girl, the joy of my life, next to me at the dinner table when we were visiting friends. I wondered what she was looking at, because I noticed that her head was going like this, and eventually she was looking at the ceiling, and eventually she had arched all the way back unnaturally and was looking at the wall behind her. I picked her up and tried to straighten her body out, but she was stiff as a board and unresponsive, and her eyes had rolled back in their sockets, and I couldn't feel any breathing. A moment later, we were rushing through the snowy streets to the hospital as I held my stiff, quivering little girl against my chest. Now, why do I tell these stories? Each one is a story of a different kind of suffering. In the hospital, when I broke my neck, the body was in pain, but the spirit was flourishing. I grieved the loss of my Olympic dreams, but I also rejoiced in the presence of a God who would never abandon me. In the second surgery, the suffering of the body was substantial, but the suffering of the spirit was immeasurably worse. It felt for all the world as though God had abandoned me. But in time I came to learn that it was I who had abandoned God in favor of an idol and a caricature. In the third story, I was gripped with abject terror at the prospect of losing my daughter. Each of these was another course in what Kierkegaard calls the school of suffering. The question is never whether there is something to learn from our suffering. The question is whether we're willing to listen to suffering's instruction. I did not lose my 1-year-old daughter, but I've never forgotten the lesson that she can be taken away from me in an instant, that some things are eternal, but my time with her is not one of them. So what about you? We often live our lives with a kind of prosperity gospel light. If I'm a good Christian, then God will at least spare me from the worst of fates. This becomes clear when something terrible happens in our lives and we find ourselves feeling, why me? Haven't I been faithful to you? As though misfortune only falls upon the unfaithful. And yet each of us knows in our heart of hearts that our experience of suffering has been deeply transformative. Suffering has a way of revealing us to ourselves, of making visible to ourselves all of our sinfulness and need, of cutting through all the layers of pretense and artifice, of showing us our emptiness and our powerlessness apart from God. Suffering is a persistent, indeed a constant theme in our art and our literature. Yet we rarely think deeply and systematically about our sufferings. We may consider the problem of evil philosophically or theologically, either in its ancient biblical form of why do the righteous suffer and the evil prosper, or in its classical form of is the existence of evil incompatible with an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. But we rarely think carefully about the varieties of human sufferings and the various ways in which God might work through them to teach us or to draw us to himself. We rarely think carefully about how we respond to sufferings and the freedoms that we have in the face of them. Why do some people emerge from suffering stronger and some shattered? Why is suffering sometimes our teacher and sometimes nothing more than our tormentor? After I broke my neck and it became clear that I was going to suffer chronic pain for the rest of my life, I faced a decision. I did not have the freedom to decide whether or not I would suffer. But I did have the freedom to determine what that suffering would mean for me. Would I view this suffering as something essentially unrelated to my life, an accident that had no real significance for my vocation? Or would suffering instead be an essential part of my vocation? Was it at the very heart of the mystery of what God meant for my life? I decided on the latter, that I would devote my studies to the philosophy and theology of suffering. As they say, research is me-search. This academics thing is not a game. We're asking real questions. Sometimes they're questions about businesses or the sciences and how we can create things that help other people. Sometimes they're perennial questions of human experience, but they matter. The work you're doing here at this university matters. And you have an opportunity in the company of friends and scholars to examine some of the most important questions in the world, and I hope you cherish that. So I went from Stanford, eventually on to Harvard, and all the way along I studied suffering. I discovered that a relatively lesser-known religious writer from 19th century Denmark, Søren Kierkegaard, had written some of the most insightful things that I had found about suffering. Now, from the autumn of 1841, when Kierkegaard defended his dissertation and began earnest work on Either Or, his most popular work, to the autumn of 1855, when he last set down his pen, Kierkegaard produced a literary landscape as vast varied and treacherous to navigate as any in the modern West. The breadth of its concerns, the complexity of its communicative strategies, its contentious band of imagined pseudonymous authors, and its dazzling array of literary genres and techniques have made the interpretation of Kierkegaard a perilous endeavor and have led to many versions of Kierkegaard circulating through contemporary discourse. It's not possible for me to go into all of the methodological challenges and how I respond to them right now. But I'm going to present to you Kierkegaard as I've come to understand him after spending years poring over everything that he wrote. A few points of orientation before we proceed. Kierkegaard lived in Copenhagen in the middle of the 19th century, was a deeply devout Christian who was a dual citizen, a sort of confessional dual citizen in the sophisticated Lutheran state church, which he attended with his family in the mornings, and in the gritty, pietistic, impassioned congregation of brethren, a Moravian church that he attended with his father in the evenings. He had a famously star-crossed relationship with a young girl named Regina Olsen, a relationship that caused him great anguish. He was also held up for mockery in a magazine called The Corsair, and this happened around the middle of his authorship and continued through the rest of his life, and they're going to show some of the caricatures of Kierkegaard that were published, and this caused him a great deal of anxiety and a great deal of pain over the years for a variety of reasons. Being raised in a very melancholic household, having depressive tendencies, Kierkegaard became a student of suffering. Now, before we proceed, a point of orientation. The thing I want you to understand about Kierkegaard before we go further, he developed a kind of ideal image of spiritual maturation that passed through 4 stages: the aesthetic, the ethical, the religious, and the Christian, or sometimes called the paradoxical religious or paradoxical religiousness. In the aesthetic stage, the individual cares only for passing pleasures. These may be very refined. It may be opera, or they may be very crude. But the point is that the individual is not yet conscious of the Spirit and the demands of the Spirit. He's absorbed in relative ends, absorbed in pursuing the lesser goods of the world. In the ethical stage, the second, the individual becomes aware of the demands of the Spirit and seeks to conform himself to ethical perfection. In the ethical stage, the individual has focused upon the Spirit, but lost sight of the flesh and its limitations, lost sight of his own creatureliness and sinfulness. This, of course, is doomed to fail because, as we all know, we cannot achieve ethical perfection. In religiousness, one is conscious both of the Spirit and of the flesh, and one seeks to reconcile to God through religious means, and yet one is still doing this according to one's own will and power. In religiousness, the individual strives to understand God according to his own powers of reason, to please God according to his own powers of religious devotion, and so has not yet come to trust in the grace of God completely. It's only in Christianity, or paradoxical religiousness, religiousness B, he uses different terms in different places, that one receives who God reveals himself to be, instead of trying to understand God according to our own categories. It's only in Christianity that one, as Kierkegaard says, rests transparently in the power that posits the self. In Christian faith, one has ceased trying to be oneself apart from God, ceased constructing a false self, and receives the true self from God in faith. What's extraordinary is that Kierkegaard writes the whole of his literary production as an author according to a very careful, deliberate structure. On the one hand, he produced a series of aesthetic and philosophical works, which he published under pen names, and these were written from the perspective of people in the aesthetic and the ethical, or in the religious stage. And they were intended to illuminate the limitations of these ways of being and to point towards something higher. Kierkegaard employed this pseudonymous method in order to construct a multifaceted conversation in which different possibilities of being, different forms of personality, or different ways of living life are presented in their ideality, and the reader can find and choose herself amidst that clash and conflict. On the other hand, Kierkegaard also published a series of discourses or sermons that upheld what is true. By simultaneously showing the falsehood of what is false and the truth of what is true, Kierkegaard hoped that this dialectic of his authorship would usher the individual out of the false self toward the possibility of faith and ultimately into the life of the imitation of Christ. The final thing I want you to understand about Kierkegaard before we go further is how he understood the structure of the human self. Kierkegaard's vision of the self was radically relational. We're constituted essentially by three relationships in his vision of the self. The first is a relationship of two poles. In one pole, there is eternity and possibility and infinitude. This is what Paul would have called the spirit. In the other pole, there is temporality and finitude and necessity. And in Pauline terms, this is what would have been called the flesh. The relationship between these two poles is the first relationship. It's what I call the anthropological relationship. At our most fundamental level, we are a strange and mysterious union of the spirit and the flesh, of what survives eternally and yet lives in time, of what has possibility and freedom and yet limitation and groundedness. But this is a relationship that relates to itself. It's self-conscious. We determine how we will honor the spirit and the flesh within us. This is what I call the psychological relationship. We have self-consciousness and freedom over against ourselves to choose the kinds of selves we are going to be. This is not to say that there's no fact of the matter of who we are. There is a fact of the matter. There is who God created us to be. And if we choose to be someone other than who God created us to be, then we are choosing a false self. And when we choose to be a false self, we're actually handing ourselves over to a kind of enslavement to falsehood and sin. So Kierkegaard will call this untruth, unbeing, unfreedom. While if we are being who God created us to be, we live in truth and being and freedom. Which leads to the third and final relationship, the theological relationship, or our relationship with God. So we have the relationship of the flesh and the spirit, and this relates to itself, and then it's always relating to God. The truth is we cannot be who we are called to be, who we are created to be, apart from God. We cannot be that person through our own efforts, our own capacities, our own willpower. We can only be who we were created to be by resting in the power of the self-giving God. God created us out of nothing, sustains us in being out of nothing, and is constantly giving us to ourselves. We can only receive the true self that is Christ. We cannot take it. We cannot build it. We cannot make it. So when the theological relationship is right, when we're living in faith, and only when that relationship is right, will the psychological and anthropological relationships be right. Now I want to go on to four points about suffering. And I want to warn you that they are provocative, and they may seem extreme, and they may even seem extreme to me. But I'm going to let them be provocative, because we could use a challenge. The first point is that suffering emerges from the rupture between man and God. And in every suffering, Kierkegaard believes, God is seeking to draw us to himself. In the second set of discourses or sermons that he published in 1843, Kierkegaard gives a fascinating rendering of the creation narrative. Prior to the fall, he says the ideal was the actual. There was no distance between what the world should be and what the world really is. The is and the ought were one. Adam simply received everything immediately and transparently from God. He received truth and goodness and being from God. And all there was truth. When Adam called something by name, that was its name. But then Adam chose not to receive, but to grasp. Not to trust in the gift that was given, but to grope after the one thing that had not been given. In doing so, in reaching for the knowledge of good, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he produced the distinction between good and evil and precipitated a rupture that ran down through many levels, a rupture between God and man, between good and evil, between the ideal and the actual. And suffering flows through this rupture. Suffering is a reflection either of our own separation from God or of the world's separation from God. It emerges in the distance between the ideal and the actual. But the really important point here is that all sufferings, every single form of suffering for Kierkegaard, can be used in the economy of God to guide and lure and seduce every single individual toward him. Kierkegaard has a very intimate sense of divine governance, that God is at work in every single suffering, striving in every single particular to reach every single individual. And the contrast he's making here, I won't go into this in depth, but it's with Hegel. For Hegel, the task of philosophy is, quote, to comprehend all the ills of the world, including the existence of evil, so that humankind can be, quote, reconciled with the negative aspects of existence and understand the plan of providence. The fundamental task of philosophy, in other words, is theodicy, or explaining the existence of evil. Thus, philosophy, he says, defends reality against its detractors, and it does so by showing how all suffering has its place in the historical development of the human race. All suffering is essentially collateral damage in the march toward a better future. Hegel has no time for the suffering of the individual. Reason, he writes, cannot stop to consider the injuries sustained by single individuals, since particular ends are submerged in the universal end. Kierkegaard thinks this is precisely the wrong approach, philosophically and theologically, to respond to suffering. Instead, he attends with extraordinary care to individual sufferings and how they might serve the purposes of God, to draw the individual toward the possibility of faith. There are also other differences. Whereas Hegel values suffering insofar as it builds up, Kierkegaard finds the greater significance of suffering in how it tears down, not refining and improving what came before it, but essentially annihilating it, not strengthening the individual, but showing him his weakness. And where Hegel held providence at a distance from individuals, the finest and noblest of one generation, he writes, could well be immolated on the altar of suffering for the sake of reason's progress. Kierkegaard will emphasize that the suffering of the individual, though it may also serve corporate ends, must always also serve for the upbuilding of that individual. As Kierkegaard wrote in his first public book, Either Or, for if there were one person, one single person, no matter whether he were the most powerful who had ever lived in the world or the lowliest, who on Judgment Day could truthfully say, I was not provided for, in the great household I was forgotten. Or if there were one person who, though reproaching himself for much, could truthfully say, I confess I went astray in the world, I drifted from the way of truth, but I have indeed repented of my sin. I have lifted my voice and cried out to heaven for help, but no one answered, and I saw no way out, no reassurance, however distant. If this were so, then all would be absurdity. Then where would the limit be? Whereas he writes later in his journal, and he puts this at the end of this same book, Either Or, and when the cup of sufferings is handed to me, I shall not fix my gaze upon the cup, but upon the one who hands it to me. And I shall not stare at the bottom of the cup to see whether I have quickly emptied it, but steadfastly I will stare at the one who hands it to me. I shall gladly take the cup in my hand. I shall not empty it to somebody else's health, as on a festive occasion when I delight myself in the delicious drink. No, I shall taste its bitterness, and while I am tasting it, I shall cry out to myself, to my health, because I know and am convinced that with this drink I am acquiring by purchase an eternal health. The second point, suffering is constant this side of eternity and intensifies along life's way. What I first found so extraordinary about Kierkegaard's vision of suffering is not merely that he sees suffering emerging from these fundamental conditions of sinful human existence in a fallen world, but that he creates a very fine-grained typology of the varieties of sufferings. You might have noticed I'm using sufferings in the plural. That sounds odd, and coming out of my mouth, out of the mouth of English speakers, I think it feels odd. In Danish, the word is in the plural. And I think it creates it opens a conceptual space to think about fine differentiations in the varieties of sufferings. We don't often do this. What is the difference between melancholy and depression and despair? What's the difference between fear and anxiety and doubt? How do all these things relate together? This is what Kierkegaard did. Now, I won't go through all of them by a long shot, but there are particular forms of suffering that emerge at particular points along life's way. If you remember that theory of stages with the aesthetic and the ethical and religious and Christian, these sufferings emerge because we are, in the early stages, being something less than what God has called us to be. We exist in self-contradiction because we are either failing to choose who we are in God, or we're choosing and striving to be who we are not. So Kierkegaard created a categorization of sufferings like melancholy and depression, sorrow and pain, anxiety and doubt and despair, spiritual trial and self-denial, culminating in religious suffering, which is the suffering of dying to oneself, and then the specifically Christian form of suffering, which is suffering in the imitation of Christ and suffering persecution for imitating Christ. I'll come back to that. But each form of suffering, if we're willing to learn from its instruction, will reveal to us the sinfulness and the limitations of these ways of being apart from God. It's not merely the case that there are multiple forms of suffering and we can help individuals understand what their suffering means for them. It's that the suffering mounts along the way toward God and toward the imitation of Christ, contrary to what the world might have us believe. Kierkegaard thinks, our sufferings do not grow lighter as we grow older in this world. They grow, if we are progressing toward God, more intense. In a journal entry from 1849, he offers this brief and cryptic comparison of secular and spiritual senses of advancement. Secular ascending, he says, is like this. When a human has reached one rung of the ladder, he yearns and strives for the next one up. On the other hand, when a person has associated himself with God in such a way that God really has caught hold of him and uses him, then ascending is like this. For every higher rung he must climb, he prays like a child to be exempted. For he understands very well how, humanly speaking, suffering and misery ascend to the same level, and spiritual trial in the same proportion. Now, ascent is a common allegory in ascetic and mystical traditions. Yet Kierkegaard could not speak of spiritual ascent without this decisive qualification that ascent to true selfhood before God is simultaneously descent into ever-deepening suffering and abasement. So Kierkegaard writes that the suffering becomes greater and greater along the way of spiritual ascent, and the higher the rank, the more suffering there is. Though everyone, he says, prefers to be ranked in the ordinary, direct way and to ascend higher and higher in the esteem and favor of the world, Christianly understood, the ranking is inverted, like the calendar before Christ, as the path forward leads downward into suffering and humiliation. As Christ taught his apostles, the last shall be first and the first last. So in a book called Practicing Christianity, Kierkegaard wrote that to become and continue to be a Christian is a suffering with which no other human suffering can be compared in pain and anguish. To the degree, he says, that my being a Christian has more truth, to that same degree, this would be recognizable by the greater opposition of the world and thus the greater suffering, ridicule, and risk of death. This is not because God is cruel or wants us to suffer. It's because the world, Kierkegaard says, is inverted in its values. It celebrates what is evil and persecutes what is good. Since love is hated and truth is persecuted, he says, the loftiness of the spirit must appear inversely as lowliness and abasement, and the individual who strives to do the good will inevitably suffer in a manner similar to the suffering of Christ. God's governance is love, he writes, yet it guides the individual further and further out into suffering in order that he may come to exist as a human being for the first time and in the truest sense. But God's permission of suffering, again, is never unjustified in Kierkegaard's view. As Kierkegaard wrote in one of his most renowned works, Fear and Trembling, which again was published anonymously, it's fundamentally a question, he says, of whether one trusts in the scripture that all things serve for good for those who love God. When abandoned by everything else, each person should trust that God's love will not abandon him, that God's love loves him in the ordeal. Indeed, he says, no insult, no spiritual trial, neither things present nor things to come can wrench a person away from the love of God. Faith rests in the assurance that God's governance is always fulfilled, even in the world of suffering and trial. Third point, suffering tears down what is false and sinful in us before it builds up what is true and good. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive point in Kierkegaard's theology of suffering. Circling back and looking at the whole story of the journey of the self from the aesthetic all the way to Christian faith, Kierkegaard creates what I call the nothingness narrative. He sees the whole of Christian maturation as a journey from one creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, to another creatio ex nihilo. There is that in which we are created originally and sustained by God. Then we go through sin and suffering and the death of the false self to being recreated as the second Adam. This takes place in 5 stages. There's creatio, or creation out of nothing. There's peccatio, or sin. and the rupture between man and God. There's passio, or suffering, which illuminates our sin and our alienation from God. Then there's annihilatio, or the annihilation of the false self apart from God. And finally, recreatio, or the second creation in which we receive the Christ who is formed within us. So Kierkegaard, over the course of many works, lays this out much more finely than I can recount here. But let me just tell the basic story of the soul. What he creates here is a narrative of universal human experience, stretching from the first creation and first Adam to the second creation and second Adam. Sufferings are the long red threads, as it were, that hold this tapestry together. The individual created from nothing in innocence is given truth and freedom abundantly and immediately as the good gifts of God. But spurning the source of those gifts, the individual falls into sin and therefore exchanges being for nothingness, truth for untruth, freedom for unfreedom. In the snare of sin, the individual will become more and more untrue and unfree and enslaved. Yet if he is humble and willing to learn from the school of sufferings, then his aesthetic sufferings will instruct him in the nothingness of the finite world and self. His ethical sufferings will show him the nothingness of the self that strives to become itself on its own powers. And religiousness will illuminate his powerlessness apart from God. Suffering reveals the nothingness of the world apart from God and the nothingness of the self that defies God. The task of the individual then is to will the annihilation of the false self, to take these sufferings and turn them against the self for one's own destruction. As Kierkegaard wrote later, God creates everything out of nothing, and all God is to use, he must first turn to nothing. Or as he writes elsewhere, life at God's direction casts a person out to be strengthened in the annihilation that knows no delusion, permits no evasion, occasions no self-deception. Annihilation reveals the self to itself with devastating clarity, uncovers its nothingness, its powerlessness, and leaves it naked before God in the requirement of God. This, Kierkegaard writes, is the annihilation of a person, and this annihilation is his truth. Now, obviously, we're talking about the death of the false self, the annihilation of the false self. Thus, at last, when the individual wills his own downfall, his own annihilation, in order to rest transparently in God and receive the self that God gives, then the individual is recreated in the being, truth, and freedom of God. The second creation, Kierkegaard says, is again a creation out of nothing. Wherever God is in truth, there he is always creating, for in becoming known by a person, he wants to create in him a new human being. So the nothingness narrative tells the story of the creation, decreation, and recreation of the self, and it's a tale of suffering. The flight of the solitary spirit is from nothing to nothing, from creation to creation, where suffering is the essential middle term. Fourth and finally, suffering is essential to the way of Christ and therefore the life of the Christian. All of the other forms of suffering have flowed from ways of being and false ways of being. They've reflected self-contradiction, misrelationships between the self and God, or the self and itself. But what about when a person becomes a Christian? Why then should that person suffer? He's no longer trying to be somebody who he's not. He's receiving who he is from God. The Christian suffers, first of all, according to Kierkegaard, because the fundamental form of the Christian life is the imitation of Christ. And suffering is essential to the imitation of Christ. Christ calls us to die to ourselves, to put aside earthly comforts, and to live a life that will inevitably incur the opposition of the world. The Christian understanding of the true, the good, and the beautiful stands in stark contrast, Kierkegaard believes, to the worldly understanding. Where the world values comfort and complacency, which for the Christian is a grave danger. The world values self-mastery, which for the Christian is an illusion. The world values wealth and fame, and for the Christian those things are temptations. But the world fears hardship and striving and suffering and struggle, which for the Christian are essential elements in spiritual maturation. When we are living Christ, we will suffer the fate of Christ. It is no coincidence that Jesus simply happened to live in a time and context where the world wanted to put him to death. Kierkegaard believes that Jesus would be put to death at any time and in any place, and those who bring Jesus to life within themselves will suffer the same fate. Now, there's some room here. He talks about a martyrdom of ridicule, that the ways in which the world afflicts those who bring Christ to life within themselves can be different at different times. But he has a very stark and very challenging vision. And he looked around him and saw a church that was preaching a gospel of complacency and comfort. And he felt very badly that what was essential to the Christian message had been lost, that the cross had been lost, that we were spending all of this time celebrating the suffering of Christ and the sufferings of the martyrs and all that they achieved, but ignoring the call to take up our cross and to suffer as well. And if the people in the control room can put up the slides of the bronze bowl of Phalaris. For those who are interested, at 1 o'clock I'll be talking about this, and this is an image that Kierkegaard uses for his critique of the church. The bronze bowl of Phalaris was a bowl that, Phalaris was a king in an island off of Greece a very long time ago, and he had this bowl, which was his instrument of torture. He would take those he disliked and he would feed them into the side of the bowl, put them inside, and set a fire underneath. And yet he put reeds inside the nostrils of the bowl so that their screams as they came out of the bowl would sound like beautiful music. It's very harsh, but Kierkegaard used this as an image of the church. That we had taken all of the suffering of Jesus Christ, all the suffering of the martyrs, and transformed it into something for aesthetic pleasure. Something that would make our lives a little easier to pass, rather than really taking up the call. Now, the second point to note regarding Christian suffering, then, is that it's a double suffering. The Christian suffers not only because he denies himself and takes up his cross and follows Christ, but he suffers the persecution of a world that will always hate Christ when he appears. Due to this essential opposition between the way of Christ and the way of the world, when the Christian suffers first in denying herself in the imitation of Christ, this rouses the hatred of the world, and she suffers the second time in the persecution of human society. She who brings Christ to life will suffer the fate of Christ. Yet this Christian suffering is critical to the truth and the goodness of the Christian life. Through suffering in the imitation of Christ, Kierkegaard thinks, we come to know Christ. And in coming to know Christ, we come to know God. So Kierkegaard was aware of the modern problem of how do we know anything about God, and his answer was fundamentally Christological and existential, and it had to do with suffering. The way we come to know anything about God is through suffering in the imitation of Christ, walking in his footsteps. That's how we're ushered into God's presence. And through suffering in the imitation of Christ, we have fellowship with Christ, knowledge of Christ, and through Christ, knowledge of God. This is a tough teaching, and Kierkegaard was well aware of the strain that it required. The most extreme spiritual strenuousness in the Christian life, he writes in 1854, the year before he died, requiring the most excruciating effort is to trust that what appears to be divine cruelty is actually love. For God in love wills that the individual should come to resemble him, even though this requires the most agonizing transformation and makes inevitable the most violent collision with the world. Or in his final piece of writing, scribbled on loose sheets as his health declined, 3 days before he collapsed in the street of the illness that would take his life, Kierkegaard wrote that God had deprived him of all zest for life. But if a person in the last lap of his life, when God seemingly changes into sheer cruelty, and with the most cruelly devised cruelty does everything to deprive him of all zest of life, but nevertheless continues to believe that God is love, that God does it out of love, then that person passes the examination of life and is matured for eternity. Such a person, he says, becomes an angel.